Before we begin, I'm going to spoil all of these games. If you're here looking for a review, here's the TLDR. Buy the game. Play it. This is absolutely worth your time and money, especially for the low price of $20. With that out of the way, let's begin. At the point that you're watching this, Metroid Dread is out, but at the time of me writing this, it's not. Crazy how that works. So before getting into Dread, let's look at the other side of the Metroidvania genre, with Castlevania. And I'll let you in on a little secret. Despite playing a few Metroidvania games such as Hollow Knight and Bloodstained, I've never actually sat down and played a traditional Castlevania game. So with the Advanced Collection out, hosting what I've heard to be some of the best the series has to offer, and the hype of Metroid Dread having me itching to play a Metroidvania game, what's a better time than to get into Castlevania? We've got 4 games to look at here: Circle of the Moon, Harmony of Dissonance, Aria of Sorrow, and Dracula X, and that's the order that we'll be looking at them. Before getting into talking about these games, I would like to once again reiterate that I've never played a Castlevania game. I don't know the series staples, I don't know what these games do different, I just know that Dracula's always here. I'll be judging each game on its own, with comparisons when I feel necessary, such as calling back to the other games to make explanations a lot faster, so Circle of the Moon will likely be the longest portion of the video here. On top of the games, the collection also adds a ton of extra bits, such as a gallery where you can look at concept art, box art, and other miscellaneous drawings, and a music player with tons of tracks to listen to. Not only this, there are a few gameplay additions, such as save states. I'm going to keep use of these to a minimum in order to keep the true integrity of the game. So without further ado, let's cross into the world of Castlevania. Circle of the Moon puts the collection at a strong start. We play as Nathan Graves, a vampire hunter who works with Morris Baldwin as a part of the Belmont clan. Morris had worked with Nathan's parents long ago in an attempt to banish Dracula. This attempt was successful, but it was at the cost of Nathan's parents. Morris took Nathan under his wing, training him, and Hugh Baldwin, his son, to become vampire hunters, giving Nathan the hunter's whip that had previously belonged to the Belmonts themselves. The game starts with Morris, Hugh, and Nathan going into Dracula's castle, ready to seal him once again. They confront Dracula and Camilla, who brought Dracula back, and they're attempting to get Dracula back to his full power. We find out later that the way that they intend to do this is by kidnapping Morris, sacrificing him when the moon is full. Taking Morris, Dracula then destroys the floor underneath you, banishing you and Hugh to the Shadow Realm, his basement. Hugh runs off without you, insisting that he's going to save his father, leaving Nathan to travel this castle all alone. There seems to be some animosity between Nathan and Hugh. He sees you as lesser, saying you'll only get in the way of him trying to save his dad, with the atmosphere setting in stone that you're stuck in a near hopeless situation. Your leader was captured, his son sees you as an obstacle, and all you have to hold on to is your hunter's whip. The beginning capitalizes on the dark, dreary, and melancholy feel the game provides, dropping you in a broken basement. Sadly, this part of the atmosphere is short-lived as you move forward and get into the castle once again, and it's all very orderly, tidy, and a little too bright. While I wish it was a bit darker, the art the game provides here is stunning. I wanted to see more of what the game had to offer, and considering this was on the Game Boy Advance, it's all the more impressive. Heck, I'm playing this on my TV and the game looks fantastic still. On the whole, this game is extremely pleasant to look at and listen to, making the exploration a treat, slowly crawling through an unknown castle housing holy and solemn cathedrals to dirty and damp sewers. The environment transfers between these effortlessly. I feel lost, yet determined to press forward. Despite this feeling of being lost, I always felt I had an option for a place to look, bringing a sense of control to a situation that seemed to lack it. What helped maintain this feeling of control was the warping system. Specific rooms in an area have a giant portal, and this will warp you to the next warp room. This makes castle traversal a lot easier, and it saves a ton of time, making the exploration never overstay its welcome. So then, after exploring for a little bit, I found the dash boots, allowing me to dash after double tapping forward. Dashing was something I was really excited to get, but that excitement very quickly died. Double tapping forward is extremely uncomfortable to do, and it's difficult to pull off in tight spaces. This took a lot of getting used to, and even by the end of the game I wasn't completely used to it, with my hand feeling like it was cramping up at times. I know that this was a GBA game and they only had 4 buttons and a D-pad to work with, but this port could have added a couple of extra control options considering this game allowed you to change controls, add save states, and a bunch of extra little quality of life changes. The weird inputs of this game are bothersome when you also have your special items, which you use by holding up and hitting the attack button. The whole control scheme of this game is awkward, and it resulted in me being apprehensive about using special items. And in hindsight, this made boss fights all the more time-consuming when I should have just tried using them more often. The precision in some of the later boss fights made the weird inputs all the more frustrating, as I'm not able to dash and then turn around while maintaining my dash, or sometimes I double tap but I didn't do it quite right, leading to me taking what felt like unnecessary damage. Though this could have been because I was using a control stick instead of a D-pad. The Pro Controller has a D-pad that is less than favorable, leading me to stick with the control stick. But in the next game, I will be using the D-pad of the Joy-Cons to see if that fares better. Getting back to the game, at this point I found a weird door, and going against my patent-pending gamer instincts, I ran in, encountering the first boss of the game, Cerberus, with half health. The fight itself was tense, trading blows with each other, and finally the fight was coming to a close, and... Okay, not gonna lie, I wasn't prepared and I died pretty quickly. But I didn't go down without a fight. Dying had only sent me back a couple of rooms, as there's a save point right before the boss room, something that's true for most of the bosses. Though instead of challenging the boss again, I decided to explore a little bit more and try to find something a bit more advantageous to me. After a bit of exploring, I found the holy water and immediately went back to fight him, with my newfound beverage. I attempted again and was more successful this time by spamming holy water and tactically retreating when he rushed forward. This fight was simple, but it was a perfect first boss, teaching you the importance of spacing and how you won't be able to just rush any enemy aggressively. You have to play tactically if you want to win. After beating the boss, I got a magic item, the double jump necklace, and I'll let you guess what it does. Every time you beat a boss, you get another one of these magical items. These items allow you to go to previously inaccessible areas, whether that be a path leading forward, or areas that hold heart-ups, NP-ups, or HP-ups. But you can also find these three types of items through secret walls. So then, this sets up our gameplay loop. Explore, kill enemies, fight a boss, get a new progression item, find a new path, and repeat. It's fairly linear for the most part here. And side note, there are heart ups and HP ups. That's because hearts here aren't health. They're essentially a counter that allows you to use a special item, with most of them seeming to cost about 4 hearts. This confused me for about 30 minutes in the beginning, until I used the holy water and saw the hearts go down. The holy water was a big staple for my playthrough, alongside the cross in the last half. The holy water made a lot of boss fights an absolute joke, like Cerberus as I mentioned before. The gameplay is simple so far, just moving and using whip to attack. But you can get special items like the crucifix, dagger, axe, and holy water as projectiles. There's also one last thing, the DSS. These are cards that instill some sort of magical capabilities in your character. I'll touch on these later. Meanwhile, let's look at the enemies. The enemy variety throughout the game, for the most part, is quite nice. Complementing your moveset, you're challenged in killing enemies, trying to space properly, something I didn't think would be a challenge considering you've got a long-range weapon. Encouraging the spacing, when you get hit, you fly back. Thankfully, this doesn't extend to the enemies, having them stay still after being hurt. Getting launched back is a double-edged sword. Or should I say, a double-edged whip. That doesn't make sense. The knockback promotes more careful thinking when approaching a situation, and thankfully when it knocks you back, it's usually into a good spot so you don't get stun-locked and die, though it does still happen from time to time. And on the other hand, it can also get really obnoxious come the flying monsters. These are particularly annoying, typically being in areas that just make you fall quite far and hamper progress. These enemies here are a great example. These enemies here spawn in with an active hitbox, making the knockback mechanic more of an inconvenience than anything. Thankfully, this isn't an issue I came across too much, with many of the flying enemies being fairly slow or easy to take care of, and it was something I could overlook at the end of the day. Flying back when being hit is one of the things that shows that enemies are built around the mechanics of a game in a way that keeps combat fresh and fun. I like how because the enemies can attack through walls, you can as well. These little consistencies keep the game feeling fair, though there are still differences between you and the enemies, such as enemies having a status effect like stone, poison, freeze, or curse, or they have elements like fire, ice, and electric. Stone and freeze are essentially the same, stopping you in your tracks. The poison slowly damages you, and getting curse prevents you from attacking. Curse and freeze are the worst of the bunch here. Curse ends up making you back up as far as you can just to wait it out, which is just inconvenient. Freeze, on the other hand, is utterly awful to deal with. They freeze you so you can't move, same as stone. Except on top of this, if you get hit while frozen, you take an absurd amount of damage, usually one-shotting you. This would promote a safer type of gameplay, except the placements of these enemies are just downright frustrating, and sometimes if you get hit, By the time you mash out, you were too slow and you die anyways. I'm gonna play a few clips to showcase what I mean. So what was I supposed to do there? Just not get hit? In some cases it feels like an impossibility, something I couldn't have predicted no matter what. This area right here is by far the worst in the game, through enemy designs alone. The enemies don't feel like they spice up the gameplay, they don't bring anything exciting to the table. They're merely a frustrating hamper to progression, and it made me want to avoid the exploration and the combat that I so much love about this game. Going off of freeze, let's look at the other elemental differences. These bring a variety to the enemies, making the palette swaps a bit more substantial. Here we have the awful Ice Knight, and now its Earth variant. The Earth variant has you duck under its attack, meanwhile the Ice variant ruins your day. These small changes bring a nice set of variety to the enemies without changing the core way that they function. Where the game lacks completely and unique enemy designs, it makes up for them by being mechanically unique, which is more than enough. Now, I'm going to go back to the DSS system I mentioned earlier. A few of the many effects these have are elemental. The way you get these effects are by choosing two cards, such as mixing Mercury and Salamander to get a Fire Whip, draining MP as you use it. This is a really cool idea, bringing a nice variety to the gameplay, switching up between different strategies. Sadly though, I didn't get much use out of it, because it's quite rare for enemies to drop these, with me only getting a total of 6 out of 20 cards by the end of the game, heavily limiting my options. This is where a few of my issues with the game comes up. This game has the capacity to be quite grindy, having to kill enemies over and over to get a specific card to unlock new abilities, having the base drop rate average around 2.5%. Though there is a luck stat in the game, affecting the drop rates here, though it seems to be the only thing that luck affects. I didn't see any critical hits, so making the luck only about enemy drops had it feel like a wasted slot here, taking away more than it gives. Only certain enemies drop the cards, so on the GBA when the game first came out, the only way you'd know what drops what seems to be through a guide or trial and error, getting your luck stat as high as you can and then grinding out each enemy until you give up. Thankfully, the collection adds an encyclopedia that tells you what drops what, easing a bit of the pain. Ultimately though, I feel the system is too grindy. Instead, I would have liked to have seen mini-bosses simply being a bigger, stronger version of whatever the enemy is, with more health and an extra move, or even then, just hide some of the cards throughout the castle, rewarding perceptive players, so that way the player feels like they earned their new ability, instead of RNGesus tossing his spare change at you. To me, this didn't feel particularly worthwhile. Yes, it would be cool to have the entire magical system to utilize and spice up the gameplay, but I'm not going to waste 4 hours trying to get every single card, especially considering I can beat the game without most of them. And the grind doesn't stop with the DSS. As I mentioned, the game also has a leveling system. This feels a bit out of place, and I would personally prefer a different progression system. Perhaps a mix of leveling with something like a shop system would work better, maybe buying upgrades for your whip, such as permanent buffs or the effect of the cards, like the Fire Whip, and then beating bosses granting you another new ability. Maybe give us a bigger variety of armor that helps us increase our stats. There is armor you can find around the game, but they never really brought any substantial changes. And considering there's armor, I was surprised to see there was no shop or gold in the game. I know justifying a shopkeeper in Dracula's castle may seem a bit out there, but we have suspension of disbelief. While I never had to level grind, I always felt underleveled, making a lot of the bosses not particularly challenging, but rather big time sinks where I have to not get hit any more than 5 times. And with a control scheme that makes dashing feel unresponsive, it resulted in a couple painfully boring and frustrating fights, in areas that felt near impossible for me to clear, only for me to find out that it's not the correct next place. The leveling system is at odds with a specific portion of the game. At about the halfway point, the game opens up and provides you with 2 paths. This is the first time in which the game opens up to many paths at once to my experience. This is really cool, but it led to me finding this area I was ill-prepared for and thinking that it was the next area I was supposed to go to, as the game was quite linear so far and that's how it handled progression. So I struggled for the next 45 minutes until I ultimately decided to look elsewhere. where I found the correct next area that held an item that was nearly essential in going through the sewers. And on top of that, the level difference was substantial here, with a 7-level difference. I'm a bit conflicted. Part of it is on me for trying to brute force it for that long, and I don't want to fault the game for my stubbornness. But on the other hand, why not keep this area closed? Why open it now if it's just going to be quite difficult to clear? Especially given the level system, I think a more linear approach to the Castlevania game makes sense. Not to mention, if you brute force it, you might miss out on one of the best fights in the game, alongside some story bits, as the story progresses almost exclusively through boss fights. So then once again I have to ask, why open this area so soon? The player's likely not going to be equipped for it, and considering lots of other areas are blocked off, why isn't this one? Again, the game feels at odds with itself here, though thankfully this is the only time this happens in the game, and it's smooth sailing from here. Just put like a gap here for like, I don't know, just segue to the next area somehow. You'll figure it out, future me. You're smart enough. And finally, I've been pushing it off long enough. I'm gonna cap this off with the boss fights and the story, as both of them are intertwined. And I've already gone over Cerberus, so I won't be repeating myself. Starting off, we have the Necromancer. And writing this shortly after playing, I honestly don't remember this fight. Looking back at the footage, it's a good fight, I know I enjoyed it, but it's all around forgettable. The Necromancer is the one that informs us that Dracula is going to use Martin's soul to gain his power once the full moon arrives. The Necromancer mainly floats around and shoots orbs at you, and then in his second phase he flies around, either turning into a ball and flying around like the DBD logo, or summoning pillars of light to hurt you. All in all, this was quite the easy boss fight. The death count on this fight was 0. Up next, we have the Iron Golem. There's honestly not much to say about this fight. He just walks towards you, throws his explosive ball of light, and slams on the ground to make gears fall. Slowly, you whittle him down. This is probably the least tense fight in the game. After beating him, you obtain the kick boots, allowing you to wall jump. After this fight, though, we see Hugh again, who asks if you're trying to take his glory, reiterating that he doesn't need your help, and that he's going to save Morris on his own. The death count on this fight was, once again, 0. Right before the next fight, you run into Hugh, who you saw failed. He yells at you, saying that this is his trophy, it's his fight, and you need to back off and let him be the hero. Pressing on anyways, you're greeted by this absolute beast, Adramelech. This fight was so cool, and I was taken aback when I first entered the room. I mean, this guy is huge. This fight has many moving parts and is one of my favorites, though it's held back by 2 issues. One is the dash being the way it is. As you can see here, I can jump over this attack with a dash, getting a couple of extra hits in, but I'm in such a tight space that it's near impossible to pull off. Dodging the fireballs is perfect though. I love how they target where you are and you have to snake through them. It felt so satisfying and I loved it. Then we have these purple bubbles. This is my second issue. They interrupt you, sometimes spawning where you're about to be. I get why they're here, but I feel they spawn way too often. You can see where they're coming up, but I partially got too focused on everything else that I had a hard time focusing on these. In hindsight, having the cross here would mitigate some of my problems, but because you have to hit up and attack to throw it, you would stop dashing, bringing you to a halt. If they spawned a bit less, I think it would be better. Otherwise, this fight would be near perfect. Clearing this fight destroys the Iron Maidens. The death count on this boss fight was 11. The zombie dragons here were the fight that gave me the most trouble. I was unsure how to approach it the first few attempts, but slowly started to get it. They're quite tricky, and I should have entered this fight with anything other than the holy water, and considering I had access to the axe right before, I don't know why I never took it. There are 2 enemies here, with their moves being about the same. Both of them have the ability to swing their head at the wall to make rocks fall, where you then have to swing your whip in a circle to make sure that they don't hit you. Except sometimes they'll just hit you anyways. I'm not sure why this happens, but I wish I could tell you. They both have a projectile. The one on the right targeting where you are, and the one on the left shooting fireballs in this sort of arc. Their main way of attacking is simply by swinging their heads around. This fight is claustrophobic, and I didn't have much of a good time with it, feeling like they had a bit too much health given the few opportunities I had to attack, and the fact that there were 2 of them. Some attempts at this fight took upwards of 10 minutes, and there were some instances where I felt they moved too well in sync and put me in a position in which I had to take damage. If I were to change anything, I would give them a bit less health, and have them move a bit more as a single unit, and I can't stress enough that I do mean a bit. The positions where I felt forced to take damage were few and far between. This fight had the potential to be great, but my experience with it was mostly sour. Clearing this fight gets you the heavy ring, allowing you to push heavy blocks. Sadly, I lost most of my footage when fighting these guys, but I know I spent a good hour or so fighting them over and over. The death count was probably around 15 to 20. And speaking of death, that's the next boss. Death is a good boss, testing your ability to dodge to the max by constantly spawning death scythes, while also shooting these green orbs, and when he stands he shoots out these bone stabbers. The fight itself was simple, hectic, and fun. Taking him down was fairly easy, making it feel a bit like... Okay. So, Death is one of the more unique bosses that has a second phase, making this fight just that more tense, and giving it a leg up over certain fights. You can see my thought process here when I first see this second phase, running to the door, thinking I won, then panicking. Though, after seeing that this phase honestly didn't add much, and if anything took more away from him, he just slowly crawled as I swing at him and dodge scythes. I got comfortable here, and almost a little too comfortable, as I barely made it through this fight. It was a solid fight, if anything lacking in intensity. It felt more like an obstacle course than a boss fight, and a fight against Death shouldn't have me feel like I'm in control. I would like Death's second phase to be a bit more frantic. Clearing this gets you the cleansing necklace, allowing you to clear the red water from earlier. Putting up a good fight, I managed to only die once here. Up next we have Dracula's right-hand lady, Camilla. We saw her in the beginning of the game with Dracula. She's the reason Dracula's back, and her reason for summoning him is that people are trash, so we should give the people a trash world to reflect this. She says, "If only you gave into the darkness in your soul. The one who was with you was more honest with himself. Even my master approves of him." Showing that Hugh isn't quite the same. The fight then starts, and Camilla is huge. She slowly moves back and forth across the screen, trailing lightning underneath her, shooting purple bubbles at you to dodge. Every so often when she reaches the end of the room, she'll either go into the middle and shoot out these wave-like projectiles, or she shoots a laser that you can duck under. And if you go to the wall that she's at when shooting the laser, or get to the other side of her when she shoots the wave projectiles, you can get in a few extra hits. This boss fight was the first one to have me actually change between the different spells in the DSS. Given my limited options, I used the power that increased my damage based upon map percent completion, which drains my MP fairly quickly, but I pack a punch. So I swapped between this and the other one that increased my damage by 25%. This fight made me realize that the reason I felt like the zombie dragon fight took so long was that I simply didn't have access to everything. Had I not had the card mix to give me increased damage, I would have likely not enjoyed this Camilla fight as much, again making me wonder why the DSS was locked behind RNG. Though even without RNG on my side, Camilla was slain. Though before she dies, she tells us that we're too late, and that all that's left is for the full moon to come, to bring Dracula to his full power. And she implies the demise of Morris and Hugh. Clearing this fight gives you the Rock Wing, which allows you to jump really high. This fight took me 11 tries. Climbing to the highest point of the castle, we meet Hugh, waiting for us. When checking to make sure he's okay, he swings his sword at us, saying he's going to defeat us, to prove he is superior. Nathan assumes Hugh is being controlled by Dracula, and the fight ensues. This fight was a personal favorite of mine in the game, having to fake out Hugh and properly space the whip, timing my attacks to get an extra damage. It was all extremely fun, at least once I had the fight a bit more figured out. The initial attempts were pitiful. On top of this, the way leading to him has a ton of enemies, and it takes about a minute and a half to get from a save room back to Hugh. This is where I broke my rule of not using the save states, as I saw it was a bit ridiculous wasting so much time trekking back and forth. I died 23 times to Hugh, meaning that if I did this without save states, I would have lost about 30 minutes just getting back and forth to this fight. Starting the fight, Hugh has access to just about everything you do, and more. Besides the whip. He's got holy water, daggers, axes, and in place of the whip, he's got a sword. The sword has a couple of special abilities, with a dash forward, an almighty sword strike, and a flame barrier when he thrusts his sword into the ground. Once you hit the second phase of his boss, he glows similarly to how Nathan does when he uses DSS. Hugh then gains a couple of new abilities, such as homing swords that steal your HP, and he doubles the projectiles he throws out. This is my favorite fight in the entire game, fighting someone with just about the same abilities as you. These types of fights are always exhilarating because it's an even playing field. I barely even scratched the surface of this fight's potential, as I think the potential lies in you getting access to more of the DSS cards, swapping between them when needed. But the fight is still incredible with my limited cards. This is one of my favorite boss fights ever, and I can't stress that enough. It utilizes everything you've learned, and it puts it against you. It's tense, tricky, and it's a treat. After the fight, Hugh admits that his reason for doing what he did was due to his own insecurities. One other recognition that you got from your master, and his father. He caps this all off by saying, "Allow me self-pity for now. Help father now. I am entrusting his return to you." I admittedly wasn't invested in the story so far, but this moment still got me. Walking into the next room, we get the key to Dracula's door. Running to the ceremonial room, we see Morris and Dracula. Dracula tells us that he was the one who messed with Hugh, making him act the way that he did towards you, confirming our suspicion. The fight then commences with Dracula. He teleports back and forth, spawning bats of 3 different elements, all with different effects. Fire, sending 3 bats flying straight forward, electric, flying all over the place, and ice moving forward one by one. This phase of Dracula is quite easy. I only died to him once, and after defeating him, he says he needs his full power, leaving through a pillar of light. Morris yells at us to chase after him, with Hugh showing up to take Morris to safety. Here you can run off and go back to a save point after this, which I did, but once again I used save states to do this fight, as the save point was quite far. Dracula's second phase has him in this giant purple dragon form. He has 3 moves. A laser that he shoots out that brings up a wave of fire. He shoots out these red goopy things from his tendrils? And finally, the worst thing about this fight, the meteors. These feel completely undodgeable and deal massive damage. Because of this alone, I used save states in this fight, and I didn't feel bad about it. Dracula has tons of HP, and he feels like he's built to make you grind, in level and DSS. Using save states in this instance, I, again, didn't feel too bad. Dracula has yet another phase, though, one that's far more annoying. He just floats around with bats that seem to randomly fly out. Perhaps this was because I didn't want to grind out levels in DSS using save states, but this fight felt frustrating and underwhelming. There's not much for me to say about this other than I killed him and ended the game. Given that I save stated this fight, the death count wasn't applicable, though it did take me 45 minutes to beat. With Dracula defeated, he tells us he will be back, and that this victory is only a temporary one. Outside of the castle, we meet up with Hugh and Morris. Morris thanks us for saving him, and tells Hugh that his training shall start anew. A humbled Hugh agrees that it's much needed, and jokes with Nathan that if he goes soft, he will take over. Then the credits roll, putting an end to this era of Dracula. Except this game is entirely non-canon, so who cares? On the whole, Circle of the Moon is a treat to go through, though it's not without its flaws, and as a start to the Castlevania series for me, it has me looking forward to the next game in the collection, and even upon a replay, as I was given a password that unlocks a new playstyle that gives you all of the DSS cards right off the bat. Circle of the Moon is a fantastic game that just needs a couple of small fixes here and there, putting it at a solid 8.5 out of 10. Let's see how this next game, Harmony of Dissonance, stacks up. Harmony of Dissonance start off as best things in life do, with a wall of scrolling text setting the story. One of our friends got kidnapped, and we are now at a magical castle that might be Dracula's, I don't know. Anyways, we play as just Belmont, going into this castle with our friend Maxim, and immediately I go in to change the controls. And immediately I notice there's a dash with L and R, and immediately tested it out and fell in love. 1 minute in the game and it already fixes one of my biggest issues with Circle of the Moon. One other, Well, that was terrifying. Anyways, one other thing that I noticed about the game in comparison to Circle of the Moon is just is way floatier than Nathan. This is an interesting change, and it threw me off massively, and it was a change I admittedly thought I would hate. Otherwise, this game mostly plays the same. You've got your whip, you can get the holy water, all the other good stuff. Except, the DSS is missing here. Instead, we have access to magic books. Throughout the game, you get access to 5 books, and each one you use with whatever special item you have to produce a variety of effects. This was a cool extra bit that I used more so towards the end of the game. And while not as expansive as the DSS, I would take this any day of the week if it meant I could have the dash. At least I now know I won't have to rely on RNG to have access to everything in the game, and that is just up to me to find. At this point, I also noticed I was picking up money, meaning there's a shop somewhere here to purchase items. Harmony of Dissonance changes don't stop there. The game looks drastically different, with the characters and enemies being more detailed, and just having this blue trail behind him. The castle visuals here are still bright, but from the get-go, everything looks a bit broken down, yet very elegant, being a nice contrast to everything being super bright, setting a proper atmosphere of you being somewhere that you shouldn't be. The overall feel of this game is quite different, and honestly, I'm not a super big fan of the soundtrack in this game. It was one of the first things I noticed, and not in a good way. A few of the songs just felt like noise at some times. The main castle theme at the beginning of the game in particular got quite obnoxious. Do you see what I mean? Each area here is distinct. They're the same as they were in the prior game, adding quite a few new areas, and new areas house new enemies. Harmony of Dissonance has a nice variety of enemies, returning and not. Opting out of variants of the same enemies, instead we get mostly unique enemies. And while most of the bosses here are unique as well, we do see a few bosses that are just bigger versions of other enemies. And as I did before, I will be going over bosses last. The combat of this game I found to be a lot more enjoyable, fixing up some of my issues with the first game, adding what is essentially a dodge, giving more control in the combat. And where the game lacks an extra magic, it gives more to the basic combat of the game, the armor being more impactful here than before. And with the addition of the shop, it gives you the ability to buy armor, poison cures, curse cures, and even potions, which was something I felt to be a bit of a mistake. I know that last time with Circle of the Moon I said that I thought a shop system would help progression, and to a point here, I was wrong. Potions here cost way too little, and considering you don't have to spend any money on armor, you can just buy a ton of potions. This trivializes any boss fight that shows a modicum of difficulty, which, in this game, isn't even a problem. They should make the gold have more value, considering the armor in the shop is a lot weaker than what you get just by exploring. Leading me to the next point. This game felt like it had a more heavy emphasis on exploration. While they added a ton of new bosses and enemies, we have an entire second castle to explore, and there's a ton of little collectibles here and there. This game also feels quite non-linear, with a few things blocking your path this time around, and the level system here not mattering as much as it did in Circle of the Moon, so I actually felt confident going anywhere I wanted, even fighting some of the bosses slightly out of order without even knowing. You can find different armor sets, HP ups, MP ups, hard ups, magic books, furniture for a random room in the castle, and side note here, I love that Just goes into this castle that isn't his, that he thinks might be Dracula's, and he finds random furniture in an empty room and is like, yo, this room could be a bit more lively. Like, are you sure the Belmonts were vampire hunters and not house hunters? Anyways, you can also find pieces of Dracula, which I will touch on when I get to the boss portion. Oddly enough, with so much to explore and so much to find, Harmony of Dissonance drops the warp travel system that Circle of the Moon had, despite coming out a year after and having a castle that's twice as big. This is the biggest detriment to the game, with me getting hopelessly lost, and unlike Circle of the Moon, I didn't feel determined to go forward. I went forward because I didn't know at all where else to go. While I got lost only once, that one time had me spending 3 hours going back and forth across the entire map to break a wall to find that it led to another dead end, looking for something else to do, then finding another small thing I could break that led to another dead end, for me to find out that I just overlooked one small room. While it's my fault that I didn't look in that one area, the game should provide a better way to travel from place to place given the prior game had done the same. Why take away something that worked perfectly? Instead of spending 3 hours going back and forth, I should have only spent 20 to 30 minutes trying to figure out where to go. The two castles interact with each other in certain ways. An unbreakable wall in one castle is breakable in another, so you go, break the wall, and the wall breaks in both castles, making you have to walk all the way to the wall, break it, then go back to the warp point that takes you to the other castle, walk back to the wall, and then continue from there to the wall that you broke in the first place. It's wildly unnecessary. And as good of an idea the two castle thing is, I think I would have rather preferred to have a bigger castle. I know that that's different as the entire skeleton of the castle can be kept the exact same, so it's saved on resources. But then most of the time it just felt like I'm exploring the same area now, but with more difficult enemies. There are some areas you can see first in certain castles, and a few rooms have different layouts and looks, so it's not all completely the same. Ultimately, I think this mechanic is a cool idea, but a lot of the game doesn't seem to account for this, mainly with the warp system being completely absent. The backtracking is what kills the exploration, because otherwise this expansive castle was a joy to explore. Varied places with varied enemies, and tons of little secrets to uncover everywhere. I would talk about the story next, but honestly, there's not much of a story here. Our lady friend got kidnapped and Dracula's castle appeared out of nowhere. Dracula is also almost entirely absent from the game. There's no real enemy in this. I think some of Dracula's minions are going to sacrifice the girl in an attempt to bring Dracula back? I don't know. The Wikipedia page has literally 3 paragraphs for the story that can be summed up to Circle of the Moon, but with a girl and also no Dracula. I'll put the synopsis on the screen so you can read it. But this is quite literally the plot of Circle of the Moon. Someone gets kidnapped, your best friend is jealous of you and is secretly a bad guy, but he was actually under the effects of Dracula, and that's what made him angsty and hate you. And also they want to sacrifice your kidnapped friend for Dracula. The only thing we don't see for 99% of the game is Dracula himself. And do you want to know why? Because he's a secret final boss. That's right, in a Castlevania game, you don't get to fight Dracula unless you do a magical quest. I don't know if this is common for Castlevania games, but this seems a bit absurd personally. Granted, if you beat the game without killing Dracula, you'll either fail to save both friends or fail to just save Maxim, implying there's a better ending. So then, how do you fight Dracula? Well, you gather all of his parts, go to the second castle where angsty Maxim resides, fight him, but also wear your friendship bracelet so he knows that you love him, so then Dracula can spawn in from the power of friendship. I would also like to note that the first thing I wrote in my notes for this review was, Maxim is probably Dracula. Anyways, this is absolutely ridiculous. Why lock the main boss behind a bunch of random little items? They hide the parts of Dracula, but why hide them? We already know that Maxim found them, but then his memory went blank. Why did this happen? Oh, I don't know, Dracula or something. If Just was the one to collect him first, would this have happened to him? I don't know. This is never really gone into. We just have to accept it as is. Like, okay, sure, his memory went blank. What did he do when he was completely under the influence of Dracula? Go to random obscure parts of the castle and hide the Dracula bits? Why? Wouldn't it make more sense to, I don't know, summon Dracula himself? Like, why does that have to be this long, arbitrary process? Because gameplay? And even so, Maxim dying also seems to kill Dracula, as Dracula only gains a form when he is rejected by Maxim, but then why does Maxim need to reject him in the first place after he's downed? Why isn't Dracula just like, uh-oh, this guy's about to die, better hop out to save myself? No, there has to be an emotional friendship bracelet moment for Dracula to come out. I may be looking too much into this, but still, this is all quite ridiculous, and if anyone could explain to me why this happens the way it does, please tell me. I would absolutely love to know. As it stands, though, this story of this game is just a way worse knockoff of the Circle of the Moon story, which, by the way, wasn't even anything exceptional. As I said earlier, I wasn't even super invested into it. It was a fine, serviceable story that led to a lot of nice thematic moments. It would have done more to just do something original. I know you can only do Dracula's back so many times before having to repeat something, but back to back, and on top of that being worse? Come on. Well, as we're talking about Dracula, he's a boss, so let's take a look at the bosses. First off, we have the giant bat. This is the first boss of the game, and it is incredibly easy. The bat can shoot fire, and it drills into the ground, which leaves itself wide open for attacks. So you want him to drill into the ground, as he can only take a couple of hits before turning into bats and then becoming invulnerable for a few moments. But when he's drilling, for whatever reason, he takes like 5 hits. This is a super easy fight. I didn't die once. Up next is the living armor. This is yet another incredibly easy fight. He only walks forward like the golem in the last game, and he swings his sword down. I think this fight is meant to teach you the importance of using the dash and teaching the player to use it more regularly. Once again, though, no deaths here. Up next, we have the Skull Knight, and the Skull Knight is one of my favorite bosses in the game. He's got 3 forms, and they all play slightly differently. The first phase just has him using his sword and shield. I hope you got used to dashing in the last fight, because that's how you dodge this one. This phase wasn't too difficult to deal with. In the second phase, he loses his sword, just having the shield. He doesn't really do much here. He jumps around a lot, and I'm not sure that he actually attacks, which is a nice touch considering he's only got a shield. All in all, it was pretty easy. In the third and final phase, he loses the shield, but still acts the same, just jumping around. Except he's got a giant laser beam this time. Don't know why he didn't bring this out immediately, but to each their own. This teaches the player that ducking is an option in fights, and in some fights, it's the only option. When he shoots his laser, he leaves himself wide open, being susceptible to about 7 hits when this happens. Again, an easy phase of the boss to take out. But what I really like about this boss is how he utilizes his variety in gameplay to show the player that they have to be on their feet and improvise attacks. I died 0 times, but this was an absolute blast of a fight. Making a return, we have the Golem. He's basically the same. Attack that makes things fall, and he punches. The biggest difference here is that he has sort of a second phase. After taking enough damage, he exposes his head that you now have to hit, and he throws up rocks when wanting to mix things up. This fight was quite disinteresting. 0 deaths here once again. While not the next boss I fought, it is technically the next boss that you were supposed to fight. I encountered him 5 bosses later than I should have. That being said, I absolutely melted this guy. I saw him use 2 attacks, but for all I know, he could have done more. It's a shame too, because I liked what little I saw of him. Obviously, I didn't die to him, and I don't have much to say about it, sadly. Up next, we have the Devil, and I actually encountered him before fighting the Golem, and I killed him right before fighting the Minotaur. When I first found him, I died trying to fight him, and just decided to explore a bit more before challenging him again, which was after I had defeated the Golem. This guy's a bit annoying and hard to deal with. He flies around and has the ability to curse you, which in this game, thankfully just slows your movement. Which is still awful, but it's a step up from being completely defenseless. He mainly just flies around shooting fireballs, and he'll melee you if you're too close to him. I died once to this boss. Next we have the Giant Merman, and maybe this is because I fought this guy way out of order, fighting him after the next 3 bosses I'm going to talk about, but he was extremely easy. I wiped him in like a minute. He spin dashes at you, he sometimes summons smaller mermen, and sometimes he makes waves. Everything is extremely easy to dodge. He is, in fact, just a giant merman. I died 0 times. And next we have the Giant Slime, yet another boss I did out of order. This one isn't very special, and just a secret between you and me, it's an absolute joke. This boss is just a big slime. I wish I could say more. I died 225,000 times to this boss. And the giants don't stop there. We have another giant variant boss with the Giant Peeper. And again, I wish I could say more about these guys, but they really are just bigger versions of enemies. This one's not particularly hard to dodge. You just jump over him, hit him, rinse and repeat. I died 2,356,269 times to this boss. Finally, back to unique bosses, we have Legion Saint. And I don't think this boss does anything in the first phase. I'm just gonna show you, that'll say enough. Yeah. The second phase of this fight is a little bit more tricky, I guess. You just have to look out for those lasers that they shoot every so often, but that's about it, and even then, they don't target you. This fight was yet another extremely easy one. I died 0 times. Up next we have Shadow, the coolest idea for a boss, as he is a shapeshifter, randomly changing between one of 3 phases, with his in-between phase being a floating face that's unable to be hit. I thought it was a bit odd that you couldn't hit it, but sure, I get it. And sadly, not all forms are created equal. The sword is an absolute joke. I don't think it does anything in terms of attacking, but he does curse you if you touch him, which is something. Then we have the Panther form, which just runs back and forth and jumps, which is somewhat easy. And his final form is the Moth, and this does the most, but it only drops poison spores underneath itself. It's not really a lot. This boss fight's a really cool idea, but it fails in execution, being extremely easy. I died 0 times. Up next, we have another really easy fight, and I want to put a disclaimer here. I didn't add the death count to brag about myself not dying at all. I added the death count in Circle of the Moon to just show how difficult some of the bosses were. This game is just an absolute cakewalk. Anyways, next we have Pazuzu, which was, again, another really easy fight. He only ever did 2 things. He shot fireballs in an arc and summoned purple flying monsters. I genuinely wish I could say more about this fight, but it was incredibly disappointing and underwhelming. He didn't do much at all. He just stood there for about 99% of the fight. I cleared him in about a minute, not dying a single time. Up next, the Minotaur's back, and I'm fighting him in the correct place this time. This fight gave me a lot of challenge here, with me getting a little greedy with the timing for his ball and chain. Though about halfway through the fight, it got 10 times easier. I think I still knocked him somehow? Take a look. I beat him fairly quickly after that, as you saw. You know the drill. 0 deaths on this one as well. The second boss in a row making a triumphant return. Legion is back and he's easier than ever. Except I did die to him once because I didn't see these tiny little things on the ground and I died. As soon as I realized that was what killed me, I just swung around the whip to take care of him every so often. I don't think Legion attacks here. He just kind of sits here. I stood in basically the same spot the entire time, swinging at him over and over again until he died. It was an incredibly easy fight, though I did die once because of my stupidity. Do you remember that giant robot from the beginning of the game? Well, that's the next boss fight, and this is just the living armor fight, but bigger. I wish I was kidding. He slowly walks forward and does a sword strike. Dash back, hit, dash back, hit. I didn't die once. Again. Making his return from Circle of the Moon, and I assume every other Castlevania game, we have Death. This fight was very similar, starting off with him throwing scythes at you until you hit his second phase. The second phase is remarkably fresh, jumping on his back and attacking him as he slithers around the stage. He also got these little scythe hands if you get too close to his head. All in all, it's a really good boss fight. A definite highlight of this game. I didn't die to this boss, though. Up next, we have the Cyclops. This enemy is quite fun to fight, being all about spacing and timing. He has a hammer with quite the reach, but telegraphs when he's about to attack. He also has a dash across the screen that he, again, telegraphs. This is another one of my favorite bosses in the game. It plays with spacing quite well. I died to him once, but it was after I beat him the first time. If only I'd gone to that save point instead of adventuring further. Maxim, your friend and rival throughout this game, is an underwhelming boss fight. He's got quite a bit to work with, but it's really easy to work around. It doesn't quite hit that sweet spot that the Hugh fight did, with it feeling like an even playing field. I know I can beat Maxim, and I did quite easily. He's got a few moves, like the Shadow Clone Jutsu, where he sends 2 million copies of himself to attack you, but this is easy to stop. Just swing the whip around. He jumps in the air to do a dive bottom attack, but you can just hit him out of the air and get a bit more of opportunity to hit him. And he's got this sword thrust. Just jump over him and get a few extra hits in. He's got these weird shuriken-looking things that just go in an arc. Keep your distance from them. At about the halfway point, he uses clone jutsu to have a second clone of himself. But again, It's really easy to work around. The issue with this fight is just straight up better than Maxim. The fight isn't tense, it's an absolute slaughter. While it was fun, it wasn't tense. And as for one of the final boss fights, I felt unsatisfied completing this. I died 0 times to this boss. And finally, we have the star of the show, Dracula himself. After spending 30 extra minutes tracking down every part of him, we finally get to fight him. And after all of this time, it's once again unsatisfying. Dracula has 2 phases. The first, an easy one where he just shoots out fireballs, and his second phase where he's this unholy abomination. He's got this tentacle thing that's got grabbers sticking out that hurts you and a giant laser beam, but that's it. That's all they had for the Dracula secret final boss. The final boss was a disappointment, and the secret final boss was even more so. And while Circle of the Moon's final boss was a disappointment in the other way, that it was extremely difficult and, dare I say, unfair in certain instances, it at least felt like a final boss. I died 0 times to Dracula, and that feels wrong to say. On the whole, Harmony of Dissonance is a fun experience and is unmistakably worth playing, but it was extremely unbalanced, with me dying to 3 bosses total, and dying to them no more than once. There's nothing wrong with a game being easy, and this would be a great Castlevania game to start off on, but the bosses were a little too simple, and considering the bosses are easy, I wonder why Dracula's fight was locked behind this convoluted quest. The combat and exploration of the castle itself was a major highlight, with a few of the bosses really sticking out to me. Harmony of Dissonance is an incredibly fun time, sitting at about a 7 out of 10 for me if I had to give it a rating. But I don't think I can see myself revisiting this one. I've seen everything it has to offer. I don't need to see much more. And now, for the final GBA game in this collection, and the second to last game overall, we move on to Castlevania, Aria of Sorrow. Aria of Sorrow, much like Harmony of Dissonance, starts with a scrolling wall of text, but unlike Harmony of Dissonance, Aria tries to tell a story. And buckle up, because the story here is a total doozy. It starts in the year 2035 in Japan, and you play as Soma Cruz on your way to watch a solar eclipse. Once you arrive, you pass out and then wake up in a castle. When you come to, you meet a secret government agent named Genya who tells you that you're in Dracula's castle, to which you say, "Isn't that in Europe?" To which he says, "I mean, yeah, but this is Dracula's true castle, which is inside the solar eclipse." I completely lost it here, because how could you be in a solar eclipse? I knew that I was in for a good time with this one. Shortly after, you get ambushed by monsters. Genya destroys all of them, and then you absorb the soul of one of them. He then tells you that you awakened a special power, and you have to find the Master's Chamber. You are then sent to go through the castle, meeting many people along the way, such as Graham Jones, who explains that Dracula was destroyed in 1999, and his power still lingers, being passed down into his reincarnated form. Then you meet Yoko, who does something. I don't know, she gets stabbed like halfway through the game. You also meet an army man named Hammer, who sells you items at the entrance of Dracula's castle, which I found out in the last hour of the game. And finally, there's Jay, who brings one of my favorite interactions. The writing in this game is incredible. I don't know if it's meant to be as silly as it is, but it had me laughing anytime 2 characters were interacting on screen. Yoko reveals future plot points and straight up name drops Alucard, acting like a person outside of the game saying, "Oops, I thought you knew," when you find out it's a spoiler. Before getting too deep into the story though, I'd like to talk about the gameplay, and once again, the controls change. Maintaining the basic controls of attacking and throwing items while dropping the R dash, you keep the L dash, but it's an unlockable that you acquire fairly early into the game. The R button now goes back to a system that's similar to the DSS. Remember how we absorbed that soul? We can then equip that soul to throw spears, which is one of the 3 different uses for this. Red souls replace item pickups like the axe. the blue soul being tied to the R button, and these vary, typically as movement options or something that surrounds you like a shield of fire. And finally, there's the yellow souls, which are passives, increasing stats or allowing you to travel on top and underwater. The best part of this system is instead of having to go and look for whatever item you want to use, you can just equip them at any time. There are tons of options here, and being able to change them on the fly is especially nice, adding a fair bit of strategy into how you approach bosses and some of the stronger normal enemies. This system, while still reliant on RNG, is all around better than the DSS system. I can't seem to find concrete numbers. All I can say is that personally it felt like drops for souls were more common, which could have been because there were so many souls, which was a good solution, as I always felt I had more than enough at my disposal to tackle any given situation. Where in Circle of the Moon, I felt like I was missing out on a ton because I didn't have the DSS cards. On top of this, Aria of Sorrow gives you everything you need to get the basic end of the game, and there's a good bit of variety in the weapons we have access to as well. As you likely noticed, Soma doesn't use a whip. Instead, he uses a dagger, or a short sword, or a lance, or a hammer, or a gun? This is the biggest difference from the other two games, and it was something that I really enjoyed, spicing up the gameplay, with several weapons having certain effects or affinities. I usually went with weapons that had the biggest damage number regardless of type, though I definitely favored swords like this. You can get weapons from either hammer or by exploring the castle. This game makes gold feel worth something, unlike Harmony of Dissonance, as there were weapons in the shop that I actively wanted, spending most of my money on weapons and equipment instead of potions. Aria of Sorrow feels all around more balanced. I never felt too powerful, but I also never felt completely underpowered. When I was faced with a challenging enemy, it was because of my own failure as a player. Most of the time. Sometimes it felt like the game just wanted to throw a ton of things at me and try to pose a challenge. Like, look at this. I felt like I had no power in this situation. These guys just juke around, and on top of that, we have these statue things here pushing you and damaging you if you get too close to them, completely restricting the area that you have to work with. Or how about this boss fight? I understand what I'm supposed to do. He punches, then I move in a direction that he's punching to avoid it, but then his other hand is in the way, and sometimes he just punches with both hands at once? This didn't feel too good. And what about this fight? How am I supposed to dodge that move? I can't run away fast enough, jumping over it's an impossibility, and crouching looks like it would result in me getting hurt. Except, it doesn't hurt. You're supposed to crouch underneath it. The game clearly doesn't look like it, and given how precise the animations and attacks are, and have been over the last couple of games, you can imagine how I felt when I figured this out. Needless to say, I wasn't too thrilled. To not spoil my complete thought on the bosses, I will leave that there. With the combat covered, we can look at the other half of the game, the exploration. Aria of Sorrow strikes quite a nice balance with its gameplay loop, arguably the best between the three games so far, and the castle itself is easily the most memorable and cohesive. Each area is distinct. Every area goes perfectly into the next, with one exception, and it's the water area into the clock tower, but I feel absolutely confident that if you dropped me into a random room in a castle and didn't give me the map and told me to go to a specific location, I could do it. And the best part is, it wouldn't even take that long because they brought back the warp system. No idea why they got rid of that in the last game. Anyways, in Circle of the Moon or Harmony of Dissonance, I would have a hard time navigating. I may have a general idea, but it would take some time and I'd have to look at the map every so often. Harmony of Dissonance had a cohesive map, but it was a little too complicated in my opinion, especially with the second castle, which isn't too bad, but the map here is simple and clean, making it quite memorable in my eyes, the best iteration of Dracula's castle so far. Aesthetically, that stays true as well, opting to lean heavy into the destroyed castle idea at the start, with broken walls, then slowly becoming a more regal castle that's just a bit worn down, feeling like the castle itself has a story to tell, and given that you have other people traveling the castle with you, there's less of a tense air, making this just feel right. I can't really imagine this game if it went for a darker look, that it would be as good. It just hits everything right with me. I've also yet to mention the soundtrack, which is also incredible, the clock tower thing being my favorite. Take a listen. This track gets me absolutely pumped for exploration, and gives me this Doom type of vibe. Can you tell which of the three games is my favorite yet? Going through this castle is an absolute joy, finding secrets, backtracking to use new abilities, it was all fun. The best thing was that when I got a new ability, I knew immediately where I needed to go. Aria was the game that I spent the least amount of time in, and that's because there was never a time in which I was lost, or that I was in an area that I wasn't supposed to be in yet. Just about everything here is streamlined and generally improved upon, with few exceptions. The dash here is worse, having more end lag, and some of the visual cues aren't very good, but that's all I can think of. The story here is easily better than the other two by opting in for a more complex story with multiple characters, though when I say more complex, I don't mean the story itself is complex, it's just got many moving parts. But there are so few events that it sometimes feels like things just happen. Meeting Yoko, she foreshadows a darkness in you, and then leaves. Next time we see her, she gets stabbed. We meet Jay, make jokes back and forth, learn a bit more about the castle, and then next time we meet him, his amnesia is gone, and he remembers that he's a Belmont. We meet Graham, who tells us he's a church member, then we see him stab Yoko and say that he's going to become Dracula. I don't believe I'm skipping over things, but these events just kinda happen as you explore. The game's focus seems to be more on the one-on-one character interactions rather than continuing to tell a story, which leads to me not caring at all when Yoko gets stabbed, or not caring too much when Graham says he will be taking Dracula's power, as I know nothing else about these characters. Aria of Sorrow relies a bit on you having prior knowledge to the Castlevania series, which could lead to new players getting confused, or missing out on some of the bigger moments. Slowly though, the game does ramp up, and the final hour of this game is incredible, mixing the story and boss fights in an amazing way, so I'll be saving the last hour to talk about in its own section. So then finally, let's get to the bosses. The Creaking Skull is the first boss of the game, and being such, it's quite easy. He slams his bone down and shoots fireballs, teaching you to maintain space with the backdash and to duck to avoid certain attacks. A simple fight, but it does its job. I died 0 times. Next we have the Manticore, and this boss fight's fairly easy as well, taking what you learned from the last fight, but it's more difficult and adds a bit of verticality with platforms. When the Manticore moves its tail, you back up. It shoots fireballs, though these can't be ducked under, and it forces you to use the platforms to avoid these. This fight was also fairly easy, with me dying 0 times. We have another simple boss with the Great Armor, just one of your starting boss. He's here to teach you yet another gameplay lesson. Keep your distance. He just walks forward and swings a sword. I didn't seem to learn the lesson very well though, as I did die once. Next we have the Big Golem, which is very similar to the Giant Armor, being a huge wall that just walks forward. This is the final of the starting bosses, teaching you to not play aggressively. Crouching and backing up are your best friend in this fight. I died 0 times to this enemy. Before moving on, I would like to point out that I categorize these as starting bosses, and that's because these bosses aren't unique. You see them throughout the game, and it feels real good to destroy these enemies that had their own boss rooms dedicated to them. Some of these enemies, even like the Great Armor, have variants, but from here on out, the bosses are completely unique. Starting off with the unique bosses, we have the Headhunter, which introduces the first multi-phase boss. The first phase just has a knife and doesn't do a whole lot. It was super easy to deal with. The second phase uses magic and floats around, shooting fiery dragon heads that spiral around you, and they summon lightning. This phase has you keep moving, chasing after the Headhunter as you try to avoid what they're throwing at you, being the first bit of challenge in bosses. And finally, the third phase is a lizard thing. This phase is the worst to deal with, and as you saw earlier, it doesn't exactly have hitboxes that make sense. On top of this, it jumps around, making it quite hard for you to hit it. After beating this, I was told you could attack the tongue, which would have made the fight easier, though it would still be quite obnoxious to fight. I died to this once. Coming back for the millionth time, we have Death, and this iteration is the hardest of them. As usual, he's got 2 phases, the first one not being much of a problem, shooting scythes around, summoning lasers, though these lasers did catch me off guard a couple of times, but they really aren't that hard to dodge. I love the scythes in this fight as well though, promoting bullet hell-like movement while trying to hit the scythe. This phase is quite fun. However, the second phase has the same issue the last fight had. You see this move? You're supposed to duck under it. It doesn't look like it at all, but that's what you're supposed to do. Other than this attack, Death throws his scythe around, making it fly around the outer walls of the room, having you time a jump and a duck, depending on where you are in the room. His final attack is the slash of the scythe where he lunges forward. This one's fairly easy to dodge, just jump over him and run and you should be good, or you can space it to where he slashes above you, leaving you to only have to duck. This fight was quite fun, but having the visual to duck under his scythe throwing attack should have been handled a bit better. I died a total of 19 times. Yet another returning boss, we have Legion, and he is fairly easy, though definitely not as easy as the last game. This fight puts you in an arena that's built around the way Legion functions. Legion chases you around a large square room, and you slowly deal damage to him, trying not to get hit and killing the mummies that he leaves behind. Like last time, Legion has a second phase, which is mostly the same, with the added attack where he just launches himself like a pinball throughout the stage, and the lasers here function exactly the same as they did before. Not homey, just deciding to shoot randomly from time to time. This fight wasn't super tense until the very end, and it was fairly easy, but all in all, the fight was super fun to play. The fight didn't need to be particularly difficult. I died 0 times to him. Up next we have my least favorite boss fight in the game, Balor, and boy is Balor a bore. I don't enjoy him. He's super difficult to dodge. I get what they were going for with this one, but I feel like this fight wasn't built around the game's mechanic. Specifically, again, the dash. I could see this fight working well in Harmony of Dissonance, as you have a nice freedom of horizontal movement, because here he's supposed to hit you with the all 1-2. I know you're supposed to dodge the first attack and then go to the opposite side real quickly to dodge the other, and then attack, but the backdash here has a fair bit of lag on it, so it becomes a tight window. He also slams both of his fists together, and you're supposed to duck under this fight to dodge it. Balor's fight doesn't end here though, as he has a second phase where he no longer uses his hands, instead shooting these beams back and forth, slowly getting faster. This feels super stressful, and I got hit by it a couple of times, but I managed to beat that phase on my first go. However, I died twice to this abomination. And finally, we have Graham, our final boss. His first phase is similar to the other Dracula's first phases, shooting fireballs and meteors forward. When he's near death, he shoots out meteors that travel in a triangular arc. This phase is super easy, and then we get to his second phase where he turns into this thing. It looks terrifying, but oddly appealing. Don't be fooled though, this phase is quite easy once you get past the panic. You just have to go under the hands, then attack, avoid the lightning strikes, and hit him when you can. This fight is almost disappointingly easy. And with that, Dracula has been slain once again. The castle vanishes, and all is seemingly well. But something doesn't sit right with Soma. He says he feels the castle is still calling out to him, and maybe that's where he belongs. Upon re-entering the game, I wanted to fill out the rest of the map, and in doing so, I ran across 3 different books that had what seemed to be riddles of sorts. They're all associated with a color that is associated with one of the souls. These are hints as to what you have to equip when fighting Graham. These souls are the Flame Demon, Giant Bat, and the Succubus. I don't know why these ones were chosen in particular. If I were to guess, it would be because Dracula's standard attack is shooting fireballs, hence the Flame Demon, then Giant Bat because he's a vampire, and Succubus maybe because you're draining life force, or maybe because Camilla? Anyways, you have one of these no matter what, thankfully, and I already had the Flame Demon, but the Succubus is awful to obtain. They're simply just a pain to fight, though after a bit of grinding, I got all the souls and went back to challenge Graham. After killing him, the darkness we saw earlier gets absorbed into Soma, where Genya then reveals that you are Dracula. This is a nice twist, except they heavily imply it from the beginning. Genya tells you that you can fight the darkness, as you're good at heart. You are then sent on your final quest to defeat the chaos within you. On your way, you encounter Julius Belmont, desperately trying to explain to Julius what you're doing. You can't get through to him, so the age-old battle between Dracula and the Belmonts commences once again. This is one of my absolute favorite boss fights in a video game, especially after coming off the heels of playing 2 other Castlevania games. This was incredibly refreshing and tense. Julius is terrifying, and he does everything a Belmont would do. He throws crosses, axes, holy water, and of course, he uses the signature whip. You and Julius feel like you're on an equal playing field, despite having more at your disposal. This fight tests everything you've learned up to this point, and honestly, the game could have ended here. All in all, this fight was extremely satisfying, and uses the mechanics of the games to the best of its ability. And after the rough fight, Julius is defeated, who through fighting recognizes that you're different, there is a chance that you could fight off the darkness of Dracula. But before leaving, Soma asks Julius that if he fails, to kill him. And with that, you carry on. However, before leaving, I decided to pay a visit to everyone at the entrance of the castle. Talking to everyone, we see Soma is scared of people knowing that he's Dracula, worried that they may leave him. Saying our goodbyes to everyone, we go forth. Traveling through the portal that lies ahead, we end up in a broken and more distorted version of the castle, without a map. Crawling past dangerous enemies, you rush forward into your fate, until finally, you arrive. Sitting in front of you is the potential end. Carrying your worries, you hear the voice of those who are at the castle, cheering you on despite the demon inside having the potential to change who you are. Running in with a newfound confidence, it's finally time to fight, or against your will, be corrupted by chaos. Entering this new distorted realm, we're greeted with chaos, taking away all of our souls that we've collected throughout the game, each color represented as an enemy that we need to attack. This phase is quite simple. The three of them rotate and attack. The yellow one sends a reticle that drains your MP, the blue one sends this big dragon-like enemy towards you, and the red one shoots green gems at you. Killing each one has you regain that respective ability. Chaos has a lot of moving parts. He's got 4 eyes, a black hole in the middle, and a bone dragon that flies around. The eyes are guarded by these slow-moving green balls that you can hit repeatedly to break that are summoned by the black hole. The black hole also shoots arrows in a circular motion that are fairly easy to dodge when you realize you have to run from one side to the other. The bone dragon itself is a hitbox, while also shooting out this large green ball of energy, and honestly, that's about it. This boss fight's fairly easy and a bit anticlimactic considering the circumstances, and compared to the Belmont fight, it pales in comparison. Though, with Chaos defeated, Dracula's castle disappears. Yoko, Hammer, Genya, and Julius say their goodbyes, and then Mina wakes up Soma. Soma thanking her and the others for saving him once again, but warning her that he's changed. Regardless, Dracula's soul lies dormant and will lie dormant forever. Mina assures him that everything is going to be okay, and the two of them look off into the eclipseless sky together, and the credits roll. However, there is one other ending you can get if you die to Chaos, and I think it's better if I just show you. Honestly, there's not much more I can add to this. This ending is near perfect, despite it being a bad one. Castlevania Aria of Sorrow is easily my favorite of the 3 so far. This game is an absolute joy to play, and I have a hard time finding anything that's a big issue with the game. It takes everything the 2 games had prior and almost perfectly puts them together. I don't know if they changed anything with the leveling system, but it really grew on me over time, making revisiting areas feel a lot more fun, destroying anything in my way. The exploration and the map are perfect. The soul system and the secret boss were a great setup, the souls feeling more abundant than the DSS, and the secret ending actually being worth it this time, if only for one of the 2 fights. The boss fights were a definite step up from Harmony of Dissonance, and I want to say that Circle of the Moon had the best overall boss fights, but holding me back is how the movement system sometimes feels like it's going against the boss fight themselves, and how the difficulty curves felt a bit absurd because of this. Aria of Sorrow's bosses all in all have the best difficulty curve, with the exception of the final boss, and they felt like they were made with the game's mechanics in mind. Aria of Sorrow is a masterpiece of a game, and it has me excited to play more Castlevania games, especially its sequel. Though I won't touch on it here, this game does have another play mode similar to Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance, with you gaining the ability to play as Julius Belmont. On the whole, the entirety of the Castlevania Advanced Collection is an absolute steal at $20. 3 incredible games, each with a fair bit of replay value. It's a complete no-brainer. If you have $20, there is no reason not to buy this collection. The games here are pretty well polished, though not perfect, They're incredible experiences that anyone who enjoys the Metroidvania genre should play. I couldn't have played a better set of games leading up to Dread's release. However, there is one more game. Not from the GBA, but rather the SNES. Okay, I'm gonna keep this as brief as possible. I absolutely hate this game. Richter walks so slow compared to the enemy's movements. He's awful to control. Enemy placements are awful. The boss fights are awful. The levels feel like they're built only to inconvenience you and take absolutely all of your time. Jumps are way too precise at times, and on top of this, most of the time, they just throw Medusa heads at you. I got to stage 3 and then gave up and started using save states. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention? This game is level-based instead of exploration-based. I have no idea if this used to be the standard for Castlevania, but boy did it take away 75% of what I love about the game. Exploration? No. Movement? Awful. Combat? Tedious. Boss fights? Well, actually some of them were pretty good, except for the final boss here, which is one of the worst ones I've experienced, period. You have no real idea knowing where he is, where he will be, or where he's attacking from, resulting in you taking unforeseen damage. This game is awful. Don't even look at this game. Though, to not end this on the sour note, the music here does slap. And that's the Castlevania Advance Collection. Thank you for watching. From the bottom of my heart, it means a lot if you've made it this far. And if you did make it this far, I would love to know what you thought, and if there's something you think I could do better, or something that I just need to generally improve upon. That means the same thing. Sorry. Please, let me know in the comments down below. I'm Kibbs, and thank you for letting me take your time.